now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Brought to you by ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And Tom's Place, for the finest in men's fashion. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted.
Well, hello there, and welcome once again to the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. You know, I think it's fair to say that we here in Canada are living in a fascinating time in this country's history, for certain. And it's also fair to say that the stories that are being born during these times will be collected by the folks at Historica Canada, who will publish them in their Canadian Encyclopedia, and then offer them on television and a variety of screens as Heritage Minutes. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with those. They are used to, and I'm quoting now, explore, learn, and reflect on our history and consider what it means to be a Canadian. Joining me now, Anthony Wilson-Smith. He is the president and CEO of the aforementioned Historica Canada. It's good to see you, Mr. Smith. How are you?
I'm well, Ted. It's been a while. It's great. So delighted.
Yeah, it has been a while. I appreciate this very much. And I got to tell you something. I've always been fascinated by the Heritage Minutes, even back before, years and years ago. To me, I mean, it was because I guess what my problem is that going through high school, even though I had great high school teachers, I never felt that we learned enough about Canadian history in high school, that we learned more about European and American history than we did ours. And maybe that had something to do with people that were publishing the history textbooks at the time.
Well, you know, Ted, there's always been this idea that Canadian history is boring, which really, frankly, annoys the heck out of me because it's not, but we never sort of took the trouble to tell the stories at ground level. Like the problem is always, you know, you read about great campaigns, it's the view from 30,000 feet. Well, actually, what people want to know about is how did people feel at the time? How did they live? Were they like us? You know, what were their hopes, their fears, their dreams? Because when you understand that at ground level, it becomes much more personal. And when history becomes more personal, it becomes more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and I mentioned in the intro very briefly, that we're living in fairly fascinating times right now in this country with our relationship with the United States and even the divisiveness that exists here in Canada. And it'll be interesting to see how history looks back and recalls this and what moments that we will use and what moments Historica Canada chooses to highlight and what individuals they will choose to highlight to point out what it was like and to give people, the next generation, a better idea of what went on during this period of time.
Yeah, there's two things that strike about that, because it's all good points. One is that, of course, the funny thing about history is that from the moment you start studying it, you generally know how it ends up. Whereas, of course, in the present, we never know if it's going to be a good ending, bad ending, certain ending, or never ending for that matter. But the other nice lesson of history and of our Heritage Minutes is you don't know until they do it who your heroes are going to be. And in this case, if he's going to be a hero, certainly one of our leaders, who would have said 4 years ago that Mark Carney, who I bumped into a bit and know a little bit, but who would have said he's going to be your prime minister and he's going to be the go-to guy in the country? He probably wouldn't have said it.
No, probably not. I look back and I think I want to go back to the history of Historica Canada, as it were, because the minutes and the vignettes that existed, they all existed technically before Historica Canada was founded. So take me through that history, if you would.
Yeah, it's sort of a separate story, and yet it has a nice join to it. So back in the early 1990s, Charles Bronfman, the great philanthropist, he was in Montreal, and Charles looked around and he was concerned. It was a few years after the first Quebec referendum. He just felt like young people in the country didn't know much or have a great sense of pride in Canada. So he started thinking about what to do. And the line he used then, and Charles is still on our board now, he's still very active 30-something years later. He said, you know, every country has and needs its myths, heroes, and legends. In Canada, we have a lot of those, but nobody's telling their stories. So then he started talking to friends and experts around about what do we do about this? You know, he said, I'm prepared to put some money into it, but where do we go? And somebody, I think, may have been the one who finally said, you know, if you can sell a can of soup in a television ad in 60 seconds, why can't you sell a country? And that was kind of the beginning for the minutes. So it was 1991. The first ones came out. Almost immediately a smash hit. Ran to about 2006 or 7. And then, frankly, the money ran out. They were privately made, and Charles had moved on to other things and went on hiatus for 6 or 7 years. So when I came into Historica in 2012, we brought them back. I don't take credit for that. There was a plan in place, and we then moved through, and we've now made about 20 to 25 ever since then.
And who Who is behind the decision making in terms of deciding what topics or what individuals will be featured in these heritage minutes?
There's the big question. I mean, I do get to make the final call on this job, but I always say it's a mix of kind of research and alchemy, like kind of a magic. So we have over the years invited anybody who in Canada who wants to make suggestions about it. We've also run public opinion polls saying to people, who would you really like to see in a Heritage Minute? And then we have a team of experts, and we have a lot of, for a small place, we're about 25 or 30 people. We have a lot of professional historians in and around here, and a lot of them we call on. So, we break it all down, and then we kind of look across the country and say, who or what have we not done lately? For a couple of years ago, we thought we haven't done Alberta yet. So we did one on Normie Kwong, the first professional Chinese Canadian player. This fall, we'll shoot our first one based in Newfoundland, which will be on Gander 9/11, which will be 25 years next year
Right.
since kind of rescued the world in a way, coming across. There's kind of informal rules, and I won't go on too much, but one of the ones that we often have to explain to people is we don't make them generally about living people. We usually only make them about people after they've passed, when their legacies are complete.
Well, I think that that's probably a smart move because sometimes, and if you ask the people who hand out the Order of Canada medals, they'll go, "Well, maybe we shouldn't have given that one to so and so because we're gonna have to take it back because he's kind of pulled some stupid moves since we've given him that." And
Well,
we live
actually,
in this kind of cancel culture.
that's part of it. People mess up. Although, you also run the danger, even when you do them about people no longer with us, that years later you find out they were up to things that maybe weren't so great, or views have
Yeah,
changed. But at a certain point, you got to tell the stories. You got to let the stories come out. And then you tell the good and the bad as well, and you mix it up. Nobody's perfect around. So, that's part of the discussion as well.
and what do you do when you run into a situation such as they did in Toronto with Ryerson? And well, now they've changed the name of a university because some people didn't like the history of Ryerson. So, and if you've done one of those minutes, do you go back and edit it? Do you pull it? Because it's all available online. It's not like it runs once and disappears, right? It's all
Yeah,
evergreen.
there's two parts to that one, Ted. So the first one, in terms of Ryerson as a person, is we also run the Canadian Encyclopedia, which has about 26,000 pieces in it online. It's free for everybody to use. And we go into Ryerson's whole history. We explore, the good part about him, the less good parts or the controversial parts, and leave it out there for people to. So we haven't done a minute on him. The best example where your question's kind of going is, we did one years ago on Sir John A. and his role as the father of Confederation. And nobody can deny his place as the leading father of Confederation. But that
Hmm.
was 2012 or 13. After that, the questions started to come up about his treatment of Indigenous peoples, which is much more controversial. Big debate about that. So back about 4 years ago, we thought we have to figure out a way to address this, because he just looks too unvarnished good. All we see is a kind of smiling Sir John A., when there may at least be a suggestion of a darker side. So we pulled it for a couple of years, figuring out what to do. Took some criticism when people realized that, and I understand why they were that way. But what we finally did was, in the encyclopedia, we ran 2 essays alongside his biography and said, here's one from somebody who believes what Sir John A. did was great, including that he treated Indigenous people well. The other one said, here's where you go. Here's why we didn't, why we're very down on him. And then when you watch the minute now, you can still see the minute on its own, but you also have the option of reading for additional information about him. So we're trying to kind of cover it out, cover it for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and in a smaller, less significant way, I suppose. Reading through the encyclopedia, I was just glancing through some stuff, and I found an interesting, fascinating story on the Montreal bagels. And then there's the discussion: where did the bagels come from? Did they come from a Jewish baker in Kiev in Ukraine, or did it come from a Jewish baker in what was then Russia, which is now Latvia? Right. So there's that. And I'm sure if into these different bakeries in Montreal, there are pretty spirited discussions about where exactly did this bagel originate.
Well, I mean, as you know, Ted, that's where you get some of your most intense thing of all. Yeah, I mean, you go to Montreal, and do you go to St. Viator Bakery, or do you go to Fairmont Bakery, or do you go to some others? And I'll still say, as someone who's been living happily in Toronto for many years, but comes from Montreal, I still don't find Toronto bagels measure up too much. But man, you can have that fight. So when we run things in the encyclopedia, for example, we do actually try to make sure we have about 6 full-time editors and hundreds of experts who contribute stories to us. So we'll walk through the whole thing in a very straight up manner. Our whole goal at here is we don't take sides in history debates. We kind of like
Hmm.
to say, we're the place where you come if you're having an argument, to help settle the argument, or if you're trying to figure out what your point of view is. Come to us, read up on the story, the facts here, is presented as neutrally as we can, and you'll make up your mind. And then you'll go off and figure out what you think and join the argument somewhere else.
And everything that is produced by Historica Canada is done bilingually. And yet, and in the case of the encyclopedia, that's available in what, 50 something languages?
Almost ever since last October, it's 35 different languages, Ted. It's the 35 languages most spoken in Canada, not including Indigenous, where there's a lot of complexities about translation still. But you can find it in Ukrainian, you can find it in Russian, you can find it in several forms of Chinese, Mandarin or Cantonese, Spanish, Portuguese, pretty much you name it, and it's there. You just hit a button and it takes you there.
Well, one of the great things about it, as you talked about earlier, the fact that too many of us grow up thinking history is boring, and you've done a great job in mixing the people that you've featured in these Heritage Minutes. As you mentioned, Normie Kwong, the first Chinese Canadian to play in the CFL, who then went on, and I'd forgotten this, to become Lieutenant Governor of the province of Alberta, which is quite an amazing feat itself. So you've got an athlete there, and then you've got the story of the comic book Superman, which is written by Frank Schuster's cousin, Joe Schuster, and Frank Schuster, of course, from Wayne and Schuster. Another fascinating thing, many people would not realize that, because, again, this is not something you would have been taught in your history class, but it's the kind of thing that for young kids, it's like suddenly they take an interest in history.
Well, I always say the minutes are about kind of opening a door to history, because obviously you're not going to learn everything you need to know in 60 seconds. But if you watch a minute, you come away, the ideal is you say, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I had no idea that. I had no idea that ever happened or that person existed. I got to find out more. And then maybe you go to our encyclopedia. We offer other sources. Maybe you go to a book somebody's written. But it opens the door to history and makes you curious. And then it says there's a whole lot more out there going on than maybe I figured out. And then we kind of got you, because then you're really saying this country's really got a lot going on. And that's the goal.
Well, there's a very important piece of our history that we just celebrated recently, which is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands. And many people don't realize how important the role of the Canadian forces were. And there's a great Heritage Minute, which is narrated by Peter Mansbridge. And I thought, what a great choice.
We fought our way through Italy and then headed for Amsterdam, sweeping for Germans along the way. Our worst fear was to catch a bullet in these last hours of the war.
I was 15 when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. More than 100,000 Dutch Jews never came home. Our men were put into forced labor. By 1945, we were starving. The food drops gave us hope. And then the Canadians came.
Before Amsterdam, I couldn't have explained why we were there, all those years away from home, but the Dutch showed us why it mattered.
Papa wanted me to bring some soldiers home to thank them personally. And that's when I first saw Wilf. And I invited him over that afternoon.
Marguerite Blaise married Lieutenant Wilf Gildersleeve. They moved to Vancouver, where they raised 8 children. Today, the Dutch still remember the Canadians who liberated them.
Well, Peter's a member of our volunteer board, as is Rick Mercer, by the way, among others. We did that one to mark the 75th anniversary. And a couple of things, Ted, when you talk about importance, to give a sense of scale, we led that liberation of the Netherlands right before the end of the war. There were more than 400,000 Allied troops commanded by a Canadian. About 175,000 of them were Canadian. We lost about 7,600 killed in the war, and then about another 6,000 injured just in the Netherlands alone. But we saved them from about 20,000 people died from starvation, because as the Nazis retreated, they took their food supplies with them. So it was also our food drops. We were doing it. And a nice figure, Ted, at the end of all that, and this is a theme of the minute in some ways, 1,886 young Dutch women married the Canadian troops who were coming in and came back to Canada. And we have a nice, thriving Dutch-Canadian community to this day as a result of that.
And we have how many millions of tulips are sent to us every year?
Every year. And when I lived in Ottawa, I actually lived on a street named after a member of the Dutch family. And years ago, when I was in Holland, actually on a job, meaning journalism, I remember driving through the little town of Duinhoven just by accident along the coast, driving in the middle of town, and where the cenotaph would be in most Canadian towns, there was a Canadian tank. They had preserved it very deliberately from the taking of there and kept it in place to honor. And as a lot of people will know, since the ceremonies just took place recently, every year in May, the Dutch school children are sent to two cemeteries exclusively for Canadians, where they lay flowers in May, commemorate on each grave, and then they go back again at Christmas and light candles at each grave.
Yeah. See, that's a fascinating part of history, but that, again, may not have been taught in many cases. I'm not sure if it is now, but certainly not back when you and I were in high school. And then there are names that pop up or Canadians go, Laura Secord. Oh yeah, Laura Secord was Canadian. That's the woman who got all those chocolate shops.
And then you want to know, that's the thing. And you go, and I like a nice French mint chocolate myself, by the way. But then, of course, you find out her role in helping stave off, Americans looking to invade at that point. Sometimes it's like that. Their names or figures around, or maybe you've crossed a bridge named after somebody hundreds of times. And finally someone says, well, actually, here's the backstory. And the backstory is pretty interesting.
Well, that's what I was thinking the other day as I was watching Mark Carney, our prime minister, with President Trump, talking about the potential annexation of Canada. And I thought somebody should send this guy a box of Laura Secord chocolates with a little note attached to it saying, last time you guys tried to pull this, a woman who sold chocolates later on in life screwed you guys up.
Yeah, and we burned the White House down also, of course.
And we burned the White House down as well. And that's a great thing about this is again, the mixture of it. And then you talk about, there's a great piece, a great minute on syrup, and it shows a family of First Nations teaching French-Canadian family how to harvest syrup to make maple syrup, and that dates back to 1710.
There's, and then there's other, and these are the early ones I wasn't part of, and I'm always love to look back because there's a lot of emotion around them. And then there's, the Inuksuks, the markers that put up by Indigenous people, and one of the famous lines people remember from minutes is, now the people will know we were here. There's a few lines that are keepers. A lot of people remember the Halifax explosion with the genuine real life hero saying at the end, I've got to stop the train, which he did, the telegraph operator, knowing he was about to give his life to save life for others.
And it's interesting because back in 2012, the folks at Ipsos, the polling company, put together the top 5 minutes. And now it's 2012, so you got to remember that there's a lot that hasn't been included in there. One of those top 5, Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah. Well, who doesn't love Winnie the Pooh, but who knew that the Canadian connection was so vivid that it goes back to World War I and somebody going off from Winnipeg, as memory serves, in a regiment, and that was the inspiration for one of the great child's figures and, still beloved around the world for it. So we love that. We actually try, and this is, of course, I wasn't involved in that one, but the aim through it is to tell stories that weren't known before. There's not much point in making, for example, a minute about Paul Henderson scoring in 72, because if you're alive, then you remember. You remember playing the USSR and everything attached. It's the backstories behind them, and often they're the most human. I'll give, a quick example on that is when we did 75th anniversary of D-Day back in 2019. Rather than choosing one of the people who won a medal and did all sorts of things that day, we chose a soldier who was 47 years old, 40 when he signed up to go back to war, having served in the first, served throughout, never had his story much told. People tried to send him home a bunch of times because they said, because of course, 47 in World War, it was like being in your 60s now. He just kept refusing. He said, I've got to protect my boys who were all 18 or 19, led them through the first part of the invasion, led them into a village and was killed. And actually, Peter Mansbridge did that too. And that, to me, was emblematic of the hundreds of Canadians whose stories we never heard because they never made it home, whose efforts were very much as heroic, whose loss changed the lives of hundreds of people around them, children in villages that never got bigger. And that was really, in that person who serves so nobly is the history of all kinds of small communities across Canada. In his case, Archie McNaughton, he was from Lower North Shore Village in New Brunswick.
And the top 2, the tied for the number 1 in that Ipsos Reid poll, the Halifax explosion, which is a fascinating story unto itself, and I can understand why to be up there. But tied with that is the story of Jackie Robinson. Now, many people, unless you're a baseball player, you wouldn't understand the correlation between Jackie Robinson, the first Black baseball player in Major League Baseball, and what he had to do with Canada. And of course, it's because he broke into the major leagues playing AAA in Montreal.
And the funny...
Hey, Mr. Ricky. Boys, I want you to meet someone. Outstanding athlete, the former second lieutenant in the United States Army, and your new second baseman, Jackie Robinson.
Hi, gentlemen.
Et maintenant va tomber le Royaux. And now batting for the Royals, le deuxième but, the second baseman, Jackie Robinson.
Record numbers of cheering Montrealers helped Jackie Robinson break baseball's color bar that year. He never forgot the city that launched his journey to baseball's Hall of Fame.
And the funny thing there, of course, Ted, is it's the only minute I can think of that's made where the star is somebody who was never Canadian. I mean, in fact, spent 1 year living in Canada, Jackie Robinson. The idea, of course, was to demonstrate that he was received in Montreal as a real human being, which was not the case in the U.S., particularly in the South at that point, that he had to come north of the border to get the respect that his abilities and his qualities as a person deserved. And actually, funnily enough, we've just launched, by the way, we won't get in much, we just launched a new Heritage Minute on May 6th about Bora Laskin, the first Jewish Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We had a reception, and one of the people there was Anthony Hilton, who played Jackie Robinson, who's actually become a friend of mine, who played Jackie Robinson in that minute some 30 years ago now, I guess.
And I think that those kinds of examples are very important to illustrate the difference between our country and the United States during those days of segregation. We had the Underground Railroad, which is also featured in a Heritage Minute, and the example with Jackie Robinson. And that really defines a big difference between the United States attitude and the Canadian attitude during those days, especially. And probably as much more so now.
I think we see it in a pretty pronounced way now. I mean, Canada's not been perfect on that, and we know that. There's issues around Indigenous. We have not always been great with, with people of color or other backgrounds as well. We're always trying. And the thing I always say about history in Canada is you can look at any decade, Ted, literally throughout history and follow the track of legislation and things, but also how people treat other people. And every decade, it keeps getting better. So the story of Canada is kind of like, we make mistakes, but we keep working on our mistakes. We're not where we need to be, but we're still, we're always trying to move ahead. We either erase laws against segregation or we end informal ones. Like for years, there's a quota on Jewish people going to certain universities. So that's long gone. We have issues again today, but we never really seem to take a step back. And that's one of the great things.
Well, another part of the service that Historica Canada offers is a citizenship challenge, which has been taken by something like 250,000 students since back in 2010. I decided to take one of those.
They're tough, eh? They're hard.
I took a 10-question medium level because there's 3 levels, right? I didn't want to push myself too hard because it's been a while since I was in school, and I think I got 6 or 7 out of 10. The one that I got wrong was, at what year were Indigenous people allowed to vote in Canada? And
there's a couple of answers because also women got to vote at a different point, and Indigenous women got it further. And you're into you're so far into the 20th century. And I forget the exact year if I had the choice. It was 1940s something, right? It was somewhere around there.
I think it was 1960 was for the full vote. Yeah, and that threw me back. It really did. I thought, what? Really?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Ted, we often forget, of course, when we're born here, we don't have to take tests. We're born here. We've got that. And, people who come here by choice, and they have to work to earn it. They have to pick us because that citizenship test you refer to is entirely based on questions which are asked for people applying for Canadian citizenship. They're not us sitting here in our offices in Toronto making them up. They've, you've got to have got through that before. And, and I would say again, because as you may recall, I lived, in my journalism days, I lived 3 years in Moscow and, traveled a few places. And before I went over there, I was one of those typical younger Canadians, Canada's fine. We're not US. We're not something. We're not this. I guess we're okay. And after I'd been around, I did about 35 or 40 countries over the years. And I thought, I want to kiss the earth in Canada when I get back, because I really have a better understanding now of who we are, what we're about, and what is possible here, what we allow and what we say is just not acceptable.
Yeah, these Heritage Minutes are used in high schools and grade schools or elementary schools on a daily basis now.
Yeah, we have about 40 education guides. Every time we put out a Heritage Minute, we send out material talking about the background around there. And then there's the Canadian Encyclopedia as well. We have a network of about 18,000 teachers that we email stuff to quite regularly. A number of schools already use on our curriculum. And over the years, we've also run tests on Canadian provinces, how they're doing teaching history. So, for example, a couple of years back, we showed that only 3 of the 13 provinces and territories actually had full-time courses teaching Canadian history. Others folded it in under humanities or something, and some places only did about a year. So you're supposed to learn about 150 years of Canada over maybe an hour a day, 3 times a week over 1 year. It's not enough.
And this is what I was saying, going back to when I was in high school. I mean, I just don't recall spending an awful lot of time learning about Canadian history.
Well, no, and the other problem, Ted, is because it's, I don't want to get into legislation and jurisdictions, but, in the US, there's kind of a common narrative. I mean, everybody grows up learning the same crunch points. In Canada, and this is either better or worse, but individual provinces decide. So imagine, for example, growing up in Quebec, I learned a whole lot of Quebec history. And if I'd gone to school in French instead of English, I would have learned a different kind of history that, was much more about being defeated in the conquest, losing the wolf and the British. So your perspectives are different. And if you're, the history you learn, if you learn much at all, if you're growing up in Alberta, is way different than if you're in Nova Scotia or somewhere else. So we don't have that common national narrative. But on the other hand, it sort of creates more individualism here. In other words, you don't have to just say there is only one story of this country, because there are billions of stories of this country.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
I've had the great fortune to say that I've been associated with one of Toronto's finest names in men's clothing for more than 25 years. Tom's Place. Founded by Tom Mahalik father in 1958, Tom's Place offers brand name men's apparel at unbeatable prices. But more than that, they boast a long-serving, knowledgeable, and friendly staff that can assist you whether you're looking for casual or formal attire. And they have plenty of first-class tailors on site. In addition, Tom and his family are well known for their philanthropic work. So if you're looking to deal with great people who can fulfill your clothing desires at outstanding prices, do yourself a favor and visit Tom's Place. They're open weekdays from 11 to 6, Saturdays 10 to 5, and Sundays noon to 5. You'll find Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Or check them out online at toms-place.com. Tom's Place will suit you.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
In June of 1813, Laura Secord overheard the secret plans of the American soldiers in occupation.
If you raise your sword against Fitzgibbon, Upper Canada will be broken.
How many men can we muster?
500 infantry, battery of artillery, my dragoons. Fitzgibbon can't manage more than 50 men, small bandit natives. Not a serious resistance if you're equal to the enterprise.
Pursue the advance 2 days hence.
Take me to Fitzgibbon. Laura Secord delivered her message to the Canadian troops. The Kahnawake Mohawks forced the surrender of 500 Yankee soldiers, and the American invasion was stopped.
You've used an awful lot of great talent to portray various individuals in these minutes. Colm Feore, Dan Aykroyd, Kate Nelligan, just to name a few. I guess it's not a difficult task to convince any of these people to take part in this.
It's great, Ted. First of all, as a charitable organization, we don't have a whole, we're well off enough, but we don't have money to match Hollywood salaries or anything. But to give you two examples of recent stars of these, one is a number of years ago now, we had the great Jared Keeso of Letterkenny, a hockey player, the series. Mm-hmm. Wonderful guy. Had also been in a great cop show, 1902. And Jared just signed on in a second. He played a hockey coach in a Winnipeg Falcons story because he grew up in a hockey playing family and he's a patriotic Canadian. He came back from, I think, California then to shoot it. And in our most recent one on Boralaskan, which should be read about by now, the star is Victor Garber. And some people may not know his name, but if you know his face, see his face, you'll know for sure. So as a couple of examples of movies people may well have seen, he was the ship's designer in Titanic. He also, for anybody who's ever seen Legally Blonde, the irony there is that he played the sort of, frankly, dirtbag lawyer, law professor to Reese Witherspoon in that movie. And then he was in Alias and a bunch of TV series and Godspell years ago. Mm-hmm. And when we called through his agent sort of said, well, he's going to be busy, and said the things agents are going to say. And then we managed to reach him directly, and he said right away, you know what? My background is Polish-Jewish. This is the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. This is Canada. I feel strongly about my background and this country. I'm in. So he signed up. Great.
I was just going to say, you could almost do a minute based on Godspell, because Godspell, when it launched in Toronto, had Eugene Levy.
Yep.
Gilda Radner, I believe, was in that as well.
Yeah, because there's Gilda Radner Way, the little street here too, downtown.
The music director was Paul from Letterman Show. I'm maybe a senior.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so same. I forget. Yeah, we know.
Yeah, it'll come to us right after we finish recording this. That's the way it happened. But there was a ton of people who's really that was their break. Marty Short as well was in that as well, and Victor Garber, as I mentioned. So those kinds of, I guess those are tough. Because I mean, is that considered to be history if it isn't? Some people I guess what I'm trying to say is some people think that history has to have something to do with the movement of a country or the changing of a country.
No, the reason we haven't done it, it's funny, you raise a very good point. So first of all, I think history is kind of where you find it. And people who do cultural things that are important are influencing history as well. And Canada has a worldwide reputation for being very good at comedy, frankly. I mean, among other things, we've got a dry sense of humor that sits well. You can't even count the list of Canadians who have made it at different levels. The reason we've never done anything on, for example, CTV or those, beyond the fact we don't generally do living people, is like I would do a minute tomorrow on John Candy, but the one question you can't resolve is who's going to play John Candy? Because if you know who John Candy is and you put another actor in that part, right away you're just thinking, no, you don't look like Uncle Buck to me. You don't look like, or the guy from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So it's the challenge is recreating people who were so well known for who they were that no actor can quite play them the same way. And if we could figure out a way around that, we'd probably do something more, because there is a minute to be done, and we keep talking about it on a great Canadian comedian. People have talked about Wayne and Schuster, who go way back. I wish Eugene Levy many more happy years. He's one of the greats, but we're not, as long as we can keep watching him in movies, he doesn't need a Heritage Minute.
But you did something interesting a number of years ago. You did a Heritage Minute, which was not done live and in person, as it were, but it was done through cartoons.
We've done one animated one on Kensington Market where we felt that was right because we wanted to blend all the different histories into the place. And Ted, I don't know, and tell me if we're not shouldn't be going there because someone's nice enough to sponsor. But the voiceover at the end, of course, is the great Tom of the Tom's Menswear shop in the market, because nobody exemplifies it more than him, who came, has his roots, I guess, Hungarian or another country, and made such a success in Canada, part of the generation, successive wave after wave.
It started as the Jewish market. Victorian houses became storefronts, kosher butchers, tailors, and bakeries. Soon enough, other immigrants came to our community. Each arrival added a piece to the patchwork of our bustling bazaar. We all understood that with hard work, anything was possible. Over time, faces and languages changed, but the spirit of our village inside the city remained. See, it didn't matter where you were from, the market became home.
Neighborhoods like Toronto's Kensington Market have helped shape Canada by bringing newcomers shoulder to shoulder to build new lives together.
So we felt that we didn't need, we felt that animated characters could do it well, because then we could literally make the jump from Jewish to Caribbean to something quite, just by blending the scenes in together. And it's one of our most popular minutes, the most popular modern ones. Another one I don't even have to explain why, is Terry Fox, which we did some years ago.
I'm looking over your right shoulder. There's an export calendar from, that looks like
55 NHL hockey season. It's a gift from my wife, Ted. I'm, of course, as a native Montrealer, a lifelong Canadiens fan, who has had to, for the first time in my life, start rooting for the Leafs in the playoffs this year, because they're playing an American team right now. And I can't support, of course, otherwise. So what will happen if Toronto keeps advancing and Edmonton, for example, keeps advancing? I don't want to say. But for now, I'm not putting on a Leafs cap, but I'm there.
Okay, fair enough. I grew up with a Montreal Canadiens fan, and I grew up as a Leaf fan, and we both still have the bruises and scratches to prove our loyalty as young kids.
Oh yeah,
but that's part of it as well. There was the great riot that took place in Montreal.
Yeah, we have a minute on the Richard riot, which has since, over the 1950s come to be recognized as one of the first kind of signs of growing French Quebec nationalism in there. It was seen as the great French Quebec hero Rocket Richard, and the unilingual NHL president Clarence Campbell, and the NHL then had their offices in Montreal, so it felt very personal. When he was suspended, when he was suspended through the rest of the year, it cost him the NHL scoring title. And one of the ironies is one of the great scoring heroes of the NHL never won a scoring championship. That was his year to do it, and it was taken away from him. So that became an important cultural minute and part of Quebec's history as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important and you talk to people in the arts community who are always pounding away and saying, listen, the arts is a huge part of who we are. It's part of our history. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our future. It's a part of our children's future, and we must keep this in mind. So I'm glad that you and your colleagues have decided that it should not just be about battles and scientists and discoveries, but it's important to keep sports and entertainment as part of that as well.
Yeah, and for example, we have a minute on Lucy Maud Montgomery, who was, of course, behind the writer who created Anne of Green Gables, which is famous around the world. And we also use that as an occasion to talk about other challenges. As a woman writer in the 19th century, she faced great discrimination on that. Women weren't supposed to do anything except stay home. And she also battled mental illness. She had a lot of issues. Her diaries indicate with depression, battling that too. So it was a chance to explore those, in a kind of a modern context and say, here's somebody who overcame these things, and hopefully be an inspiration to, among others, those who struggle with mental health issues, to show that somebody got up and over it at the same time.
And the medical discoveries that come from this country.
Yeah, one of our most popular minutes ever is on Banting and Best and the discovery of insulin. And we just did that one 4 or 5 years ago. And it was, Ted, in the first month of release alone, and we put them out online now, we'll almost always average over 1 million views. And the insulin one, I think, was over 2 million in the first month and ultimately got over 8 or 9, possibly even 10 million views. It's still very popular out there.
Send that one to RFK Jr., will you?
Yeah, there's that, but also that one reminds, and I'm guilty of forgetting the name of the person. We try very hard to get people who do those voiceovers at the end, sort of talking about how the story ends up. We try to get people who are very well associated. So you talked about Peter Mansbridge having done it before. Peter's dad was actually in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, during the war. Feels very strongly about military service. That one on the discovery of insulin was voiced by a Canadian Nobel Prize winner for work in chemistry, a woman now teaching at U of Waterloo. We've had, and our new one that I mentioned on Borlaug, the first Jewish Supreme Court Chief Justice, the voiceover at the end is by Beverly McLaughlin, who's Canada's longest serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and of course the first woman in that role, so some feeling for it. So we look for people who are very, living examples of where these great events and achievements by people led to.
And what did you choose Lloyd Robertson to do?
Lloyd voiced the Terry Fox thing at the end for us. Wonderful guy, of course. I've known Lloyd, I haven't seen him in some time, but known Lloyd for years. So the reason for using Lloyd in the Terry Fox voiceover was because he actually covered the Terry Fox run back in 1981. And so when we called him, he was in immediately. And Ted, if I can, on something on our commitment to authenticity and getting our details right, to give you some examples from the Terry Fox shoot, we needed an actor to play him, but we needed, to not show his face for most of it, since people know what Terry Fox looked like. So we actually did a countrywide search, and we found a young man, wasn't actually an actor then, but who not only had lost the same leg, part of the same leg to cancer, had even lost it, in this case, to the same form of cancer, but was the same height and everything else, and, fitted him with a prosthetic leg from 1981. There have been great advancements since then, but we wanted the old one so it would look proper within. We went out on eBay and we found a van from that year, and we had it painted over in the same colors as they had. And we scoured pretty much every secondhand store in Canada to find a T-shirt with the run stuff on it with the same font that Terry used then. And then what we did about the issue of everybody knowing what he looks like is we finally, in the last 5 seconds or so, showed a real live clip of the real Terry running in place, so you sort of look and say, yeah, that's our man. But before, and we had collaboration with the Fox family, who were quite wonderful in that too.
Another one of the programs that you offer up is the Memory Project, which is an opportunity for veterans to share stories.
Yeah, and that began in 2001, the Memory Project, Ted, and it initially began, of course, by then with a lot of World War II veterans. There's a lot of interest, and we put them in schools. And naturally, over the years, we've lost a lot of them. We've lost a lot of them, period, and begun to work more with veterans, for example, of Afghanistan, of the conflicts in Serbia and beyond. But remarkably, we still have three veterans from World War II. One, I believe, is 99. I think two of them are 101 and 102, respectively, who now do it by Zoom. They don't go to the schools, but they still speak. And it's a very emotional experience, whether it's them or other veterans, because you go to these places, as I have, and you'll see 16, 17-year-old students seeing these older people around. And at first you can see them thinking, what do I have in common? There's like, why do I want to hear this? And then they start to hear the firsthand stories of what it's like in combat. You know, how you land on a beach in seconds, you lose your best friend from as long as you can remember is killed several feet from you. You're fearing for your own life. You don't know where to go. The bullets are flying around. You know, what does it feel like? And you can see the students start to connect. And even more importantly, you can see the students start to think, what would I do in that situation if my country needed me to step up? Am I there for that? Would I have the same level of courage that those people had, the same commitment? You know, am I prepared to do that? So they put themselves in the shoes of these people, these veterans, and you kind of see at the end of it all, the years fall away on the veterans. They somehow seem much younger again. The students go up, they embrace, they leave. They've each shared an experience. And a lot of these veterans, as their families have told us many times, never told their stories until they're in their 80s. They were of that era that thought, you don't talk about the tough stuff you've done.
Yeah.
And often the families would say, you know, it's the first time we've ever heard him or sometimes her tell us that story. We're so grateful. And I think the veterans finally came to the realization, if I don't tell this story, who will? And if these stories aren't told, they'll be forgotten. And all these people of my generation, including the soldiers lost in World War II, their stories won't be known. So I have a bigger responsibility than myself to speak up. And I think that's what.
And I know that must have been a difficult task because I've interviewed a number of authors over the years who have written about the wars, and they've collected various soldiers, and they sit down to talk to them, and all of a sudden they freeze and they just say, I don't want to talk about it, and they literally just get up and walk out of the meeting. It's just too damn tough.
Well, it's so painful, and it brings back memories that we now identify as, you know, PTSD as well as a stress syndrome. But I had the experience years ago, Ted, in the mid-90s as a reporter of going over to France before the anniversary of D-Day, the 50th anniversary, and going out with a Toronto veteran named Charlie Martin, who's been gone some years now. But we went out in a boat, one small craft one morning, and, before dawn, and recreated what it looked like to be on the choppy seas out there coming into land. And you could look even then, and they've kept the old pillboxes, the German pillboxes in place, and you could feel, you know, the boat bucking and see the things right there and the markers where the machine guns were, and know that they had to get off those boats wearing heavy equipment. Some of them drowned when they got off. And Charlie recreated that whole thing and then led me through the town where you can still see the pock marks from the submachine gun bullets that hit there as they fought their way down through town. And we ended up that day at the Commonwealth Cemetery and paid a visit to the grave of his best friend from that time who died that day. And when you do that and you're alongside someone, you understand why it's so hard for them to live that memory again.
I'm going to throw a question at you, which is a little bit off the beaten path, and I'm doing this only because prior to becoming the editor of Maclean's magazine, which is where you and I first met, you were the Moscow bureau chief.
Yep, 3 years.
And I was just during as the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it was the final days, Ted, late 80s, early 90s. I did 2 months Russian immersion at military academy in the U.S. to prepare before that, and then went over. And it was really just starting to fall apart at the seams. It was the first time. It was a remarkable experience. I made it to about 12 of the then 15 republics. I spent a couple of weeks in Afghanistan about a year after the Soviets moved out, and about 10 years before the West went in. Was up and spent a February week in Siberia, and in February, it was as cold as you'd think, and had a lot of really remarkable experiences, and watched the country go to ruin at the same time, but get better at least for a while. As it's sort of easy to forget that after Gorbachev paved the way to the end of communism, and they had a good 10 years or so before they started back on the dictator trap again.
And keeping that in mind, can you predict or can you foresee some kind of an end to this conflict? It's not a conflict, this invasion of Russia and Ukraine.
I used to say to a friend of mine who was Russian but had spent some time in North America, he was a journalist, and I used to be very optimistic about saying, democracy was coming in. And he said, no, you don't understand. The history in this country is that people actually prefer strong men as leaders, that will bring fear on the world stage. And they're mad at Gorbachev because he's cost us that. And I realized, and he was later killed in mysterious circumstances, the journalist was, and I realized that there's at least something to that prestige matters sometimes more than the living standards in the country. And Putin fulfills that. He gives them that attention back that they want. And if living standards aren't what they would be otherwise, you're either hungry to be seen on the world stage, or of course you're afraid to speak out against that leadership. So it's a dark past, although the upside is 10 years before the end of the Soviet Union, inconceivable that it could have happened. And the other example I would give you is that I was in East Berlin, the communist side, about a month before the Berlin Wall fell. I remember flying in, watching a torchlit parade down the Unter den Linden at night, where the Nazis had paraded in their day, and the East German troops coming down in jackboots and goose-stepping in the same way, and thinking to myself, maybe they finally got their 1,000-year Reich. And 40 days after that, the wall fell and it was all over. So you never know how fast things can unravel.
Yeah. It's been fascinating chatting with you, Anthony Wilson-Smith, and I thank you so much for the work that you and your colleagues have done. It's great stuff. It's so important. Canadian history is, again, I don't want to keep harping on it, but it's something that I don't think that we know enough about. Maybe it's changed now in the educational system. I certainly hope that it does. For anybody who has any interest in this country and its past, check out everything that is available, whether it be the minutes, whether it be the encyclopedia, or whether it be the memory project for that matter. It's all online. It's all free. And if you've got the wherewithal, make a donation, because the government is not subsidizing you on this.
They support some programs, Ted, but we depend a lot on support. It means a lot in material terms, and also to see that support from Canadians as well. It's a way of showing people care. But I also want to just say what a pleasure and privilege it is for me to be in this chair, to wake up every day to feel there's a chance to move the dial in this country in a way, and to have talks like today. It's such a pleasure.
Good stuff. All the best, my friend.
Thank you, Ted.
That'll do it for another episode. Thank you for tuning in. Check out our past episodes. Go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca. You can leave your comments and your thoughts. And while you're online, fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. In the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.